The air in Dr. Aris Thorne's bioengineering lab tasted like burnt ozone and regret. It clung to my tongue, a metallic ghost of the event that had twisted this once pristine space into a landscape of shattered dreams and melted plastic. The security clearance had taken longer than usual, a testament to Thorne's reclusive nature and the proprietary nature of his work, but now I was finally inside. My boots crunched on ceramic shards, each step echoing in the sudden quiet. The emergency lights cast long, stark shadows, painting the devastation in monochromatic tones. Twisted metal beams jutted from the ceiling like skeletal fingers, and entire workstations had been reduced to slag. This wasn't just a fire, this was an explosion, contained but catastrophic. My eyes, trained to dissect chaos, began their work, cataloging the destruction, searching for the pattern beneath the mess. "Forensics is all yours, Reed," the lead detective grunted, his voice tight with fatigue. He stood by the scorched entryway, a hand resting on his holstered weapon, his gaze sweeping the wreckage with a practiced disinterest. "Initial assessment points to a runaway reaction." Thorne was working on something big, something volatile. Could be an accident, or, well, a self-inflicted end to a project gone wrong. He gestured vaguely towards the epicenter of the blast, where the remnants of a large, cylindrical containment unit lay fused to the reinforced floor. His assistant, the one who found him, said he'd been increasingly erratic, pushing the limits. I nodded, my attention already elsewhere. The narrative was simple, clean. A brilliant mind, pushed to the edge, an experiment that backfired. It fit the profile of a solitary genius, obsessed with world-changing breakthroughs. But simple narratives often concealed complex truths. The silence of the lab was punctuated only by the distant hum of the building's ventilation system, struggling to clear the acrid scent. I moved deeper into the lab, my gaze sweeping across the control panels, now nothing more than fused circuits and melted screens. Every piece of equipment, every scattered component, told a fragment of the story. I noted the precise angle of a collapsed shelf, the way a specific section of the floor had buckled inwards, not outwards. The body of Dr. I knelt, examining the area. The burn pattern here was intense, a deep charring that radiated outwards from a central point. Consistent with the detective's theory. But something else snagged my attention. A faint, almost imperceptible discoloration on the edge of the scorched outline, just beyond where the main blast would have consumed everything. It was a secondary char, thin and shallow, shaped like a small, elongated streak, almost like a brushstroke. It didn't belong to the primary blast radius. It was too precise, too localized. It suggested a different energy signature, a different source, applied after the initial event, or perhaps simultaneously but from a separate vector. My brow furrowed. An accidental explosion of this magnitude would leave a chaotic, symmetrical burn pattern, a violent expansion of energy. This streak, however, spoke of a directed application, something deliberate and controlled, even within the maelstrom. My gut tightened. This wasn't a simple accident. And it certainly wasn't suicide, not if this secondary burn was what I suspected. I straightened up, turning to the detective. I'll need full access to the security logs, thermal imaging from the moment of the incident, and anything else the building management can provide. My voice was calm, but the gears in my mind were already turning, building a framework of doubt. Sure, Reed. Standard procedure, the detective replied, still focused on the broader picture of destruction. he wouldn't have seen the streak. No one would, not unless they were looking for the things that didn't fit, the tiny anomalies. My next stop was clear. I needed to see Thorne himself. The body could hold further answers, corroborating or contradicting this initial unsettling observation. I packed my instruments, the faint smell of burnt electronics still clinging to my gloves. The lab, for all its devastation, was only the first chapter. The air here was sharp, antiseptic, devoid of the metallic tang of burnt circuitry. A colleague from the medical examiner's office, a woman with kind but weary eyes, met me at the door. "He's ready for you, Reed," he said, his voice hushed. Dr. Thorne. Extensive thermal trauma, internal injuries consistent with a high-energy blast. No obvious signs of struggle, no defensive wounds. I nodded, pushing through the swinging door. Inside, the room was brightly lit, a stainless steel expanse designed for meticulous observation. The gurney held a heavy, gray body bag, zipped up to the chin. I pulled on a fresh pair of gloves, the latex stretching taut over my fingers. "Thank you," I murmured, my gaze already fixed on the form beneath the sheet. The medical examiner's colleague stepped back, giving me space. With a practiced movement, I unzipped the bag, revealing the upper torso of Aris Thorne. His skin, what little remained unmarred, was pale, almost translucent. The extensive burns were immediately apparent, covering his face and upper body, just as the colleague had described. My eyes, however, weren't scanning for the obvious. They were seeking the subtle, the almost invisible. I leaned in, a magnifying glass held steady. The burns around his neck and chest were deep, but I traced their edges, following the pattern. Then I saw it. A minute detail, barely a pinprick, on the skin just beneath his left earlobe, near the hairline. It was a tiny, circular mark, distinct from the larger, more diffuse thermal damage. It looked like a focused point of entry, not an outward splash. And around its periphery, an almost invisible residue, a crystalline dust that shimmered faintly under the harsh light. It was inorganic, alien to human tissue, and certainly not a byproduct of a conventional explosion. This wasn't just a secondary burn. This was an ignition point, a deliberate, precise application of energy. The residue, too, was a signature. Someone hadn't just blown up Thorne's lab, they had targeted him directly, with something very specific, something designed to mimic a catastrophic accident. The microscopic trace and the unusual burn pattern at the lab now clicked into place. This was no accident, no suicide. This was a calculated execution. The tension in the room, previously just the weight of death, now sharpened into something far more dangerous, the presence of a ghost, a meticulous killer. I pulled on a fresh pair of gloves, the latex stretching taut over my fingers. "Thank you," I murmured to the police detective, who gave me a curt nod before stepping back, leaving me and the medical examiner with the gurney. We were in the trauma center cold room awaiting examination, a sterile, echoing space that smelled faintly of disinfectant and something colder, metallic. The air hummed with the quiet efficiency of the refrigeration units. The medical examiner, a woman with sharp, observant eyes and hands that moved with practiced precision, unzipped the heavy gray body bag. The fabric peeled back, revealing Dr. Aris Thorne. He looked nothing like the vibrant, if reclusive, genius I'd seen in his university profile. His skin was mottled, a sickly gray-yellow, with angry red burn marks marring his left side and arm. His hair, once meticulously styled, was singed and matted. The blast had been brutal. Initial assessment points to extensive blast trauma, the examiner stated, her voice low and clinical. Fractured ribs, internal hemorrhaging, severe thermal burns. Consistent with a localized explosion in close proximity. She pointed to an area on his chest, where the skin was not just burned but seemed to have been forcefully impacted. I leaned closer, my gaze sweeping over the body, searching for the minutiae. The burns were deep in some areas, particularly on his torso and left arm, but surprisingly superficial on his face and the right side of his body. It was an uneven distribution, almost as if he'd been partially shielded. The source of the blast wasn't uniform. The patterns feel asymmetrical, I commented, more to myself than to the examiner. Almost like a secondary event. A focused point of impact, not just a general concussive wave. I moved to his singed lab coat, still clinging to his frame. It was charred and ripped in places, but I noticed a peculiar detail on the fabric near his right shoulder, an area less damaged by the primary thermal assault. Using my forceps, I carefully scraped at a minute speck. It was a crystalline particle, no bigger than a pinhead, catching the harsh overhead light with an almost iridescent, deep violet sheen. It was utterly out of place. Thorne's lab was a sterile environment, filled with highly controlled compounds, but nothing I'd seen in the preliminary inventory matched this. This was something else entirely. Did you notice this? I asked, holding the forceps up for the examiner. She peered at it through her loupe. No, she admitted, a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. Could be anything. Dust from the building, a fragment from his clothing that reacted to the heat. Or something that shouldn't be there at all, I countered, carefully transferring the particle into a sterile evidence pouch. My gut tightened. A simple lab accident, a tragic miscalculation, that narrative was already cracking. This violet fleck felt like a misplaced puzzle piece, hinting at a larger, more complex picture. My initial report to the police detective was brief, focusing on the inconsistencies I'd observed and the peculiar trace evidence. He listened, his brow furrowed, but his gaze still held a skepticism I was used to. The official line was still accident, and it would take more than a single, microscopic fleck to sway it. My first stop was the university's administrative building, a sprawling structure of glass and steel. I started with Dr. Silas Vance, a rival scientist whose name had appeared frequently in the initial background checks, always in the context of academic sparring and competition over funding. Vance met me in his polished office, overlooking a manicured quad. He was impeccably dressed, his posture rigid, a thin smile plastered on his face that didn't quite reach his eyes. A tragedy, of course, Vance began, gesturing for me to sit. Aris was brilliant, driven, but perhaps a little too obsessed with his own genius. Obsessed? I prompted, watching him carefully. His hands, resting on his mahogany desk, were clasped tightly. He guarded his research like a dragon its hoard, Vance scoffed, a flash of resentment in his tone. Refused collaboration, dismissed peer review. Thought his work was too advanced for mere mortals. My own project, for instance, which was far more grounded and, frankly, ethical, often lost funding because of the grants Aris hoarded. He leaned forward slightly. He had a knack for making enemies. Not violent ones, mind you. Just Professional adversaries. Any specific adversaries come to mind? Vance hesitated, then shrugged. Beyond myself, you mean? He alienated several promising junior researchers. One, a young woman named Maya, had a particularly nasty falling out with him last year. He accused her of intellectual theft. She claimed he exploited her contributions. It got quite ugly. He offered me a thin smile. I believe she left the university shortly after. The next interview took me to a bustling coffee shop off campus, the air thick with the scent of roasted beans and sugar. Maya, the former research assistant, was easier to track down than I expected. She worked at a small tech startup downtown. She arrived looking tired, her eyes red-rimmed, but there was a spark of anger beneath the fatigue. He destroyed my career, you know, she stated flatly, stirring her coffee with unnecessary force. I poured 2 years of my life into his project, late nights, weekends. I helped him refine the core algorithm, the very thing that made his bioengineering breakthroughs possible. And then, when it was ready to publish, he tried to cut me out entirely. You accused him of intellectual theft. He was a thief, she snapped, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself. He was paranoid, possessive. He saw threats everywhere. He thought everyone was trying to steal his ideas, even when they were our ideas. I left because I couldn't stand being near him anymore. The man was a walking ego. Did you ever go back to the lab after you left? She shook her head emphatically. Never. Couldn't stand the thought. Besides, he changed all the access codes. Not that I'd want to, anyway. What's the point? It's all tainted now. Her gaze drifted, lost in thought. He kept his real research, the dangerous stuff, in a separate, heavily locked chamber within the main lab. Only a few people knew how to access it, and he changed the codes constantly. He even had a backup system, a manual override, hidden behind a false panel near the main console. He was obsessed with security. I thanked her, leaving her with her cooling coffee. The violet fleck, the uneven burn patterns, Vance's professional animosity, Maya's bitter resentment and intimate knowledge of the lab's intricacies, the pieces were still scattered, but they were beginning to show a pattern. This was no simple accident. Someone had been very, very deliberate. And they had left a trace. The cooling coffee on the desk of the corporate security chief seemed a fitting parallel to the case itself, once hot with initial assumptions, now growing cold under the weight of accumulating anomalies. This was no simple accident. My gut churned with the certainty of it. I left the corporate security chief's office, the sterile hum of the facility replacing the clink of her ceramic mug. My destination was the secure server room, a vault within a vault, where Thorne's digital life was stored. The air grew colder as I descended, the scent of ozone and recycled air thick in my nostrils. 2 uniformed guards, faces impassive, acknowledged my access codes before the heavy door hissed open, revealing a labyrinth of blinking lights and humming machinery. Inside, I found a vacant workstation, its screen a blank canvas awaiting my interrogation. I logged in, my fingers dancing across the keyboard, bypassing layers of encryption. The facility's digital archives were vast, but Thorne's project, codenamed Genesis, had its own dedicated partition, protected by an entirely different set of protocols. It spoke volumes about its sensitivity. My access was grudgingly granted, permission extracted from a higher authority after a protracted negotiation. The project files bloomed across the screen, a dizzying array of data logs, sequencing readouts, and theoretical models. Thorne's work, as I understood it, involved advanced genetic sequencing, pushing the boundaries of what was thought possible in cellular regeneration and manipulation. The implications were staggering: a cure for endemic diseases, perhaps, or a means to enhance human resilience. The same principles could be twisted, weaponized, creating pathogens of unprecedented lethality. The sheer volume of data scrolled past, a testament to Thorne's relentless dedication, or perhaps his obsession. I started with the access logs, a digital breadcrumb trail of every interaction with the Genesis project files. The timestamps were mostly consistent, a steady rhythm of Thorne's own activity, often stretching into the late hours. But then I saw it, a cluster of anomalies within the last 2 weeks. Several login attempts from an unregistered IP address, all blocked, but highly sophisticated. These weren't brute force attacks, they were subtle probes, testing the perimeter. And then, a successful login. Not through the unregistered IP, but through Thorne's own credentials, roughly 3 days before his death. The log indicated a remote session, initiated from outside the facility's secure network. My brow furrowed. Thorne was meticulous about security. Why would he access his own highly classified project remotely, especially given the risks? I dug deeper, cross-referencing the remote session with internal activity. There was none. The remote session was followed by a flurry of activity within the Genesis project folder itself. Specific files, labeled with alphanumeric sequences that hinted at core research data, had been accessed. Not just accessed, but altered. I pulled up the file versions. The original files were intact, but copies had been made, manipulated, and then deleted. A digital ghost in the machine. Someone had been sifting through Thorne's most sensitive data, creating modified versions, and then attempting to wipe their tracks. The sophistication of the data manipulation was striking. It wasn't a clumsy deletion, but a deliberate, layered attempt to corrupt the metadata, making it appear as if the files had never existed. But the server's robust backup protocols had captured the original versions, alongside the manipulated ghosts. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Someone had not only gained unauthorized access but had been actively modifying Thorne's research, perhaps trying to understand it, or worse, to twist it. And Thorne himself? Was he complicit, or had he been compromised? The burn patterns, the missing components. Could this digital intrusion be linked? I stood, the cold air of the server room doing little to quell the rising heat of my suspicion. Her earlier evasiveness now seemed less like professional discretion and more like genuine fear. I found her in her small, glass-paneled office, staring blankly at her monitor. Her shoulders were hunched, her usually neat hair slightly disheveled. She looked smaller, more fragile than before. "We need to talk," I said, my voice low. She flinched, turning slowly. "Any changes?" She hesitated, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. He was different these past few weeks. Jittery. He started talking about being watched, even in the lab. He'd check the security cameras, sometimes multiple times a day. He changed his access codes, even from me, for some of the deeper project files. Her voice dropped further, almost to an inaudible murmur. He said someone was trying to get inside his head. To get inside his work. Inside his work? I echoed, the phrase resonating with the digital manipulation I just uncovered. She nodded, her gaze fixed on some point beyond me, lost in a memory. He became paranoid. He even started carrying a small, encrypted drive with him everywhere, saying it was the only safe place for the real data. He wouldn't let it out of his sight. A small, encrypted drive. A physical backup, a last resort against a digital invasion. Thorne hadn't been paranoid, he'd been prescient. He knew he was being targeted. And whatever was on that drive, it was likely the key to everything. The scattered pieces weren't just forming a pattern now, they were screaming in aim. I just didn't know whose yet. I still felt the ghost of the encrypted drive in my palm, a cold promise of answers nestled against the growing dread of what those answers might reveal. Thorne hadn't just been brilliant, he'd been fighting something. And that something had likely killed him. My gaze drifted to the microscopic slide on my workbench, holding the almost invisible trace element I'd painstakingly scraped from the anomalous burn pattern. It was a fragment smaller than a grain of sand, yet it held the potential to unravel everything the initial investigators had so neatly packaged as an accident. The hum of the mass spectrometer filled my personal analysis chamber, a low, persistent thrumming that often preceded a breakthrough. I adjusted the focus on the high-resolution optical microscope, the faint shimmer of the sample filling the screen. Its unusual coloration, a muted, almost iridescent gray, had already piqued my interest. Standard lab materials, even the exotic ones Thorne worked with, didn't typically present like this under focused light. I loaded the trace into the sample chamber of the spectral analyzer. The machine word, cycling through frequencies, bombarding the fragment with energy, coaxing its secrets out into the open. The display flickered, then stabilized, painting a complex spectrum of peaks and valleys. I ran a cross-reference against known databases, expecting a match to some obscure chemical compound, perhaps a byproduct of Thorne's experimental reagents. The first few passes yielded nothing definitive. The system flagged it as an unknown, a frustrating label that usually meant more grunt work in the archives. But I had a hunch. This wasn't a random contaminant. I adjusted the parameters, widening the search to include synthetic polymers, materials not commonly found in biological research but prevalent in high-tech manufacturing. The screen flared with a partial match. Then another, more complete. My breath hitched. It wasn't a single element, but a complex, multi-layered polymer. A synthetic, highly durable composite with a unique molecular signature. The database entry flashed, poly-methylmethacrylate, poly-tetrafluoroethylene, copolymer, reinforced with carbon nanotubes. I'd seen this before, not in a biology lab, but in technical specifications for advanced aerospace components, high-end industrial robotics, even certain specialized security systems. It was designed for extreme durability, low friction, and exceptional heat resistance. It was expensive. Very expensive. This wasn't a lab accident byproduct. This was a piece of something manufactured, something sophisticated, and something deliberately introduced. The initial report had focused on the catastrophic failure of Thorne's experimental apparatus. But this polymer wouldn't fail. It would survive. It would resist. My mind raced, connecting the dots. Thorne's research, while groundbreaking, required immense funding. Funding that often came with strings attached. Corporate entities were always hungry for the next big breakthrough, especially one with the potential Thorne's work hinted at. This polymer, this trace of high-end industrial application, screamed corporate involvement. OmniCorp. The name surfaced immediately. They were the primary financial backers of Thorne's independent research facility, known for their aggressive R&D acquisitions and a history of pushing boundaries, sometimes ethically questionable ones. They produced everything from consumer electronics to advanced defense systems. This polymer, or something like it, could easily be part of their specialized manufacturing processes. The suicide theory, the accidental miscalculation, they both disintegrated under the weight of this microscopic evidence. This was no accident. This was a deliberate act, executed with precision, using tools and materials that pointed away from Thorne's own lab and towards a well-resourced, external player. Someone had wanted Thorne's work, or wanted him silenced, and they had gone to extraordinary lengths to make it look like something else entirely. I spent the next hour making calls, navigating layers of corporate bureaucracy. Getting an audience with anyone significant at OmniCorp wasn't easy, even with my badge. Eventually, I secured a meeting with their designated liaison for Thorne's project, a corporate compliance officer named Alistair Finch. The name sounded clipped, efficient, and entirely too formal. The immediate availability of the liaison, despite the short notice, struck me as a calculated move. Too eager, perhaps. The OmniCorp tower was a monolith of polished steel and tinted glass, reflecting the gray city sky like a distorted mirror. My shoes made barely a sound on the plush carpet of the executive floor. The meeting room was minimalist, all sharp angles and cool tones, dominated by a large, oval conference table. Alistair Finch, a man in his late 40s with meticulously styled silver hair and eyes that seemed to constantly assess, rose as I entered. His suit was impeccable, a silent testament to OmniCorp's corporate power. "Investigator Reed," he said, his voice smooth, devoid of any discernible emotion. "Thank you for coming. We're, of course, deeply saddened by Dr. Thorne's untimely demise. A brilliant mind, truly." "Mr. Finch," I replied, taking a seat opposite him. "No pleasantries from me. My investigation is moving past the initial assessment. I have some specific questions regarding OmniCorp's involvement with Dr. Thorne's research and the materials supplied to his facility." He steepled his fingers, a practiced gesture. "OmniCorp provided substantial funding, yes. And certain proprietary components, under strict NDA, for Dr. Thorne's experimental apparatus. All standard procedure for such sensitive, cutting-edge projects." "What kind of components?" I pressed, watching his eyes for any flicker. "High-performance alloys, advanced ceramic composites, specialized circuitry," he listed, almost too readily. "All designed to withstand the extreme conditions his research sometimes necessitated." A flicker. Subtle, but it was there. A micro-expression, quickly masked. His smooth facade remained, but the air in the room seemed to thicken. "That specific formulation is highly specialized," Finch stated, his tone carefully neutral. "It's used in a very limited number of our advanced industrial applications. Not typically something we'd supply to an independent research facility, even one as prestigious as Dr. Thorne's. But it's an OmniCorp material," I pushed. "And it was found at the scene." He paused, a beat too long. I'm not aware of any such material being provided to Dr. Thorne. Our records are meticulous. He leaned forward, a show of earnestness that felt entirely disingenuous. Investigator, we are fully cooperative. We want to understand what happened to Dr. Thorne as much as you do. His work was invaluable to us. Perhaps a rogue element? A third-party supplier? Or someone intimately familiar with Omnicorp's specialized materials, I countered, letting the implication hang. Someone with access. Finch sat back, his eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. That's a serious accusation, investigator. It's an observation, Mr. Finch. I'm merely following the evidence. And the evidence points directly to your corporation's unique material. I let my gaze sweep across his carefully composed face, feeling the tension radiating off him. He was evasive, yes, but also overly cooperative, almost too helpful in offering alternative explanations. Finch's performance replayed in my head. The smooth denials, the quick suggestions of rogue elements or third-party suppliers. It all felt rehearsed, a script designed to deflect. He hadn't admitted anything, but the subtle shift in his demeanor when I mentioned the specific polymer was all the confirmation I needed. Omnicorp was involved, deeply. And they were trying to hide something. The murder, I now suspected, wasn't just about Thorne's research, it was about protecting corporate secrets, or perhaps, acquiring them. The air was frigid, biting at my exposed skin, yet it offered a strange clarity. Thorne's remains lay under a white sheet on a stainless steel gurney, awaiting further forensic pathology. The initial examination had concluded with the accident theory, but I knew better. I pulled back the sheet from his arm, revealing the singed, discolored skin. The microscopic polymer trace wasn't just a random fragment, it was a clue, a deliberate fingerprint left by a killer who thought they were untouchable. Standing there, looking at the silent evidence of a life abruptly ended, the magnitude of what I was up against truly hit me. This wasn't just a murder, it was a corporate conspiracy, a web of connections reaching far higher than I had initially imagined. And I had only just begun to untangle it. I stood hunched over a stainless steel table, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, casting a sterile glow on the samples I'd brought back for re-examination. The air itself felt heavy, each breath a little colder than the last. Mr. Finch's carefully constructed composure from yesterday still replayed in my mind. His evasiveness, yes, but more so his overt cooperation had been a tell. He'd given me enough to confirm the polymer's corporate origin, but not enough to explain its presence. A classic misdirection. The heat signature of the polymer, minuscule but distinct, stood out like a beacon against the scorched metal. This wasn't an accident. Accidents left predictable patterns. This residue, this specific burn, spoke of intent, of a controlled reaction designed to look uncontrolled. Thorne hadn't made a miscalculation, he'd been targeted. And the unique polymer, a material only his corporation supposedly possessed, was the killer's calling card. The city was just beginning to stir, the rumble of distant traffic a low thrum against the quiet. I was halfway to my vehicle, my thoughts already mapping out the next steps, a deeper dive into Finch's corporate patents, a forensic audit of their material distribution, when a sudden, jarring roar ripped through the relative calm. The vehicle swerved directly into my path, forcing me to leap back onto the curb, my shoulders slamming against the brick wall of the building. The sedan's tires shrieked, a brief, violent protest, before it corrected course and sped away without a backward glance, disappearing around the corner. My breath hitched. The driver hadn't just been careless. There had been a deliberate, almost practiced aggression in the maneuver. This wasn't a random incident. Someone was sending a message. The rest of the drive to my personal lab was a blur of heightened awareness. The familiar, comforting clatter of the city now sounded predatory. When I finally reached my lab, a nondescript space tucked away on an industrial estate, I paused before unlocking the door. I scanned the corridor, the fire exit, the stairwell. Nothing seemed amiss, no visible signs of forced entry. Yet, a prickle of unease snaked up my spine. Inside, the air was still, the way I'd left it. My instruments sat precisely where they belonged, the microscope covered, the chromatography column prepped. I walked slowly through the room, my eyes sweeping every surface, every angle. Nothing obvious. No broken locks, no disturbed dust. Then I stopped at my desk. A stack of printouts, Thorne's preliminary research notes, which I'd meticulously squared and weighted down with a small lead block, was subtly askew. Not much, perhaps a quarter of an inch, but enough. The lead block itself had been shifted, angled slightly differently. And the faint sheen of a fingerprint, not mine, marred the pristine surface of my optical scanner, barely visible unless the light caught it just right. My jaw tightened. Whoever had been here was good. Professional. They hadn't wanted to leave a trace, but they hadn't accounted for my meticulous habits, or the way I cataloged every minute detail of my environment. The near miss and the lab breach, coming so close together, solidified my conviction. I was no longer just investigating a murder, I was being investigated myself. Someone knew I was getting too close. The escalating incidents spurred me to action. Maya, Thorne's assistant, was the only other person intimately familiar with the lab's daily operations and, crucially, its security protocols. If anyone had noticed anything out of place, it would be her. I found her in her small, cramped office, surrounded by stacks of files, looking utterly drained. She flinched when I entered, clutching a pen so tightly her knuckles were white. "Maya," I said, keeping my voice low, "we need to talk. About Thorne, about the lab. And about anything you might have seen, no matter how insignificant." He hesitated, his gaze darting to the closed door, then back to me. I don't know what you mean, Reed. Everything was normal. Until it wasn't. Normal doesn't leave a man incinerated, Maya. And normal doesn't leave traces of a corporate exclusive polymer. Normal doesn't involve someone trying to run me off the road, or breaking into my lab. I watched her face, saw the fear flicker in her eyes. Someone is very interested in keeping this quiet. And I think they know you might have seen something. Her composure fractured. A small, ragged gasp escaped her. She pushed herself back from her desk, knocking a stack of papers to the floor with a clatter. You think someone broke into your lab?" I nodded slowly. "I do. And I think it's connected to Thorne's death." "Tell me, Maya. What aren't you telling me?" She wrung her hands, her eyes welling up. I didn't want to say anything. I thought I was imagining things. After hours. A few times, before. Before it happened. I saw. A light. In the main lab. Long after Thorne had left. Moving inside. I thought it was Thorne, maybe he'd forgotten something, or was working late, but his vehicle wasn't there. Anything? Just tall and fast. Like they knew exactly where they were going. They didn't trip any alarms. I checked the logs later, but I convinced myself it was a glitch, or just my imagination. I was tired, read. And they were always gone by morning. An unknown individual, accessing the lab after hours, bypassing security, before Thorne's death. Not a glitch. Not her imagination. This was the missing piece, the confirmation that Thorne's death was a calculated act, not a tragic accident. The polymer, the burn patterns, the corporate connection, and now, the clandestine access. Someone had been preparing for this. The game had just escalated. The flicker of the monitor screens cast shifting shadows across my face, a stark contrast to the sterile glare of the lab I'd left hours ago. The confirmation from the security logs, the unauthorized entry, the bypass of multiple failsafes, had ignited a cold fire in my gut. Thorne's death wasn't a tragic accident. It was a meticulously planned execution. I leaned into the console, my fingers flying across the holographic keyboard, navigating the labyrinthine architecture of Thorne's lab's environmental control system. Every sensor reading, every air filtration cycle, every pressure fluctuation for the last 72 hours was logged here, a digital footprint of the lab's existence. Most forensic analysis focused on what was missing from logs. I was looking for what was subtly, deliberately wrong. Lines of data scrolled past, a torrent of numbers and timestamps. The lab was designed for extreme precision, a hermetically sealed environment where even a fractional deviation could compromise an experiment. This meant the systems were constantly self-regulating, a symphony of minor adjustments. But around the time of Thorne's death, the symphony hit a discordant note. My eyes snagged on a series of entries. A pressure drop, minute but sustained, began almost an hour before the estimated time of death. It wasn't sharp, not a sudden rupture, but a gradual bleed, then a subtle compensatory increase, then another drop. It mimicked a system struggling to maintain equilibrium, a slow leak, perhaps. But then, a distinct spike in a specific gas compound, a compound used in Thorne's experimental polymer synthesis, but in quantities far exceeding any known protocol. This wasn't a leak, it was a release. I cross-referenced the gas release with the lab's internal temperature logs. Precisely 35 seconds after the gas spike, a heating element, typically used to cure specific materials at low temperatures, registered an anomaly. A brief, intense surge, then a rapid cooling. It was too fast, too violent, for a standard operation. It looked like a catastrophic overload, designed to fail. This wasn't random. This wasn't a malfunction. This was a sequence. I drilled deeper, searching for the commands that initiated these events. There was no direct override command from Thorne's console, no external hack attempt logged by the network's perimeter defenses. This was more insidious. Deep within the system's diagnostic protocols, nestled amongst routine maintenance scripts, I found it, a subroutine, dormant for months, that had been activated. It was designed to run a full environmental stress test, simulating various failure modes. But this particular iteration had been subtly modified. It wasn't a test. It was a weaponized script. The script initiated a multi-stage manipulation. First, it triggered the controlled release of the inert gas, slowly displacing the breathable atmosphere. This wouldn't kill immediately, but it would disorient, weaken, and likely incapacitate Thorne, making him vulnerable. Then, the specific gas compound was introduced, designed to react under the now altered atmospheric conditions. Finally, the heating element surged, not just to fail, but to act as a catalyst. The precise combination of gases, pressure, and heat would have created a localized, intense reaction, mimicking a catastrophic failure of Thorne's own experimental setup. I saw it unfold in my mind's eye, a horrific ballet of engineered destruction. The pressure drop, the disorienting rush, the specific gas filling his lungs, then the searing heat as his own polymer reacted violently, consuming the oxygen, creating the burn patterns I'd seen. It explained the microscopic polymer trace, the unusual charring, the way Thorne was found, slumped over his console, not struggling, but overcome. The initial report had noted the unusual internal burns, inconsistent with a simple explosion. The digital sequence I'd just unearthed provided the missing piece. The gas wasn't just a component, it was an accelerant, interacting with his physiology and the environment to create a devastating, internal combustion. The subroutine had been activated remotely, disguised as a secure update from an authorized internal IP address. Not a direct hack, but a command issued by someone with legitimate access credentials, someone who understood the system's intricacies, someone who knew Thorne's research inside and out. The killer had weaponized Thorne's own protocols, turning his sanctuary into a tomb. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was an intimate betrayal, a calculated dismantling of a brilliant mind using his own tools. The killer hadn't just murdered Thorne, they had orchestrated a performance, a macabre illusion of self-destruction. The tension in the room was palpable, a silent hum against the whir of the servers. I had the how. Now, the focus sharpened, cutting through the digital noise. The pool of suspects had just narrowed to a terrifying few. It wasn't the sterile chill of the lab, but a deeper, more absolute cold, designed to halt time, to preserve. The white sheets covering the examination table were stark, unforgiving. The confirmation of the unauthorized entry, the bypassed failsafes, it had solidified my conviction. Thorne's death wasn't an accident. It was an execution, meticulously disguised. But why go to such elaborate lengths? Simple theft of research, while a common motive in this cutthroat industry, didn't quite fit the level of theatricality, the almost artistic precision of the sabotage. This wasn't just about taking something, it was about erasing it, or perhaps, preventing something. I had brought a secure terminal with me, its screen a small, vibrant rectangle against the muted tones of the room. On it, I was sifting through the recovered fragments of Thorne's personal hard drive, the data mirroring the physical fragments of the man himself. My gaze drifted from the screen to the still form beneath the sheet. I pulled back a corner of the sheet, revealing a hand, pale and still, a faint, almost imperceptible burn pattern tracing the tips of 2 fingers, a detail I'd noted during the initial lab inspection, inconsistent with the larger, more chaotic damage. It was too precise, too contained. My mind raced, connecting the physical evidence to the digital. The burn pattern, the unusual residue. It pointed to a very specific, controlled application of energy, not a random explosion. It was a signature, I realized, of a method designed to appear accidental, but also to leave a subtle, almost invisible mark.
A mark for someone like me to find.
Back at the terminal, I focused on Thorne's project files, specifically those marked Project
Chimera. The initial data suggested it was a groundbreaking leap in bioengineering, capable of revolutionizing medicine. But as I dug deeper, past the meticulously organized public-facing files, I noticed anomalies. Small, almost imperceptible gaps in the data stream, like missing frames in a film. Not deleted, but hidden. My breath hitched as a hidden directory flickered into existence, nested deep within a seemingly innocuous system folder, protected by an encryption protocol far more robust than anything Thorne had used for his main research. This was it. The killer wasn't just after Thorne's work, they were after something within his work, something he was actively trying to conceal. The process was agonizingly slow, each failed attempt a fresh wave of frustration. But determination was a current in my veins. I remembered the glint in Thorne's eye during a brief, chance encounter months ago, a man consumed by his work, yes, but also by a quiet, almost desperate urgency. Finally, the screen shimmered, and a cascade of files appeared. Thorne's voice, raw and unfiltered, spilled onto the screen. October 14th, the implications are horrifying. My original intent was healing, regeneration. But the applications. Omnicorp is pushing for something far beyond medical. They see a weapon. A designer pathogen, controllable, targeted. Omnicorp. The corporate giant looming over Thorne's research. This wasn't just about academic rivalry or corporate espionage, it was about global security. November 3rd, they believe I'm still compliant, still oblivious. But I've been documenting everything. The clandestine meetings, the off-site facility, the rogue team they've assembled. They're accelerating development. I can't let this happen. My work was meant to save lives, not end them. The logs continued, detailing Thorne's growing unease, his attempts to subtly divert resources, to slow down the Rogue project. He spoke of fear, of being watched, of the immense power Omnicorp wielded. He was planning to expose them. Not just to a regulatory body, but to a specific, unnamed journalist, someone he believed could handle the truth. December 1st, the data is compiled. The full scope of their betrayal, their ambition. I've secured it, duplicated it, preparing for release. They won't stop me. The world needs to know what Omnicorp is truly building. If anything happens to me, the truth must come out. Reveal/discovery, a final entry, dated just hours before his death, detailed the specific location of a dead drop, a public library locker, a specific code, where he had hidden a physical drive containing all the incriminating evidence. He had foreseen this. He had anticipated the worst. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening thud. The elaborate murder, the staged accident, the precise burn pattern designed to look like a malfunction but was, in fact, a targeted incapacitation. To prevent him from exposing Omnicorp's clandestine project, their weaponization of his discoveries. The motive wasn't theft. It was suppression. The killer hadn't just eliminated a scientist, they had destroyed a whistleblower. And now, I had to find that dead drop before Omnicorp did. The hum of the refrigeration unit seemed to take on a more ominous tone, a low thrum of impending danger. The game had just changed. Dramatically. The dead drop. Thorne had seen it coming. The physical drive, hidden in a public library locker, held the key,
the final piece he'd meticulously documented. But that was for later. First, I needed to identify the hand that had orchestrated this sophisticated deception, the individual who had navigated Thorne's labyrinthine security with such chilling precision. I sat hunched over my console, the glow of multiple screens illuminating the sterile confines of my secure analysis station. The air hummed with the quiet thrum of processors, a stark contrast to the chaotic scene I'd left behind at the lab. My fingers danced across the keyboard, pulling up the digital blueprint of Thorne's world. Access logs, biometric scans, security camera feeds, network traffic, and a comprehensive database of every individual with even tangential access to the facility. My initial sweep cast a wide net, encompassing everyone from the senior research scientists to the cleaning crew. Each profile was a mosaic of professional history, personal details, and security clearances. I needed someone with not just access, but specific, intimate knowledge of Thorne's groundbreaking work and the intricate vulnerabilities of his custom-built systems. The catastrophic failure, the precise damage, the microscopic traces of the accelerant, these weren't random acts. They spoke of a surgical strike, executed by someone who understood the intricate dance of the lab's mechanisms. I began cross-referencing. First, I filtered for individuals with advanced engineering or biochemical expertise. The list, initially numbering in the dozens, shrank considerably. Then, I overlaid it with those who had regular, unsupervised access to the restricted zones where Thorne conducted his most sensitive experiments. The intersection of these two criteria yielded a handful of names, a tightly knit group of colleagues and collaborators. Each name was a potential thread. I pulled up their daily schedules, their past projects, their financial records, anything that might hint at a deviation, a motive, a skill set that went beyond the academic. The way the explosive residue had been contained, the specific structural points targeted, it required an understanding of the lab's unique materials and architecture. One profile, in particular, began to snag my attention, pulling at the edges of my focus like a loose thread in a finely woven fabric. It belonged to the Omnicorp liaison, a representative tasked with overseeing the corporate funding and intellectual property protection for Thorne's research. On the surface, his profile was impeccable, a background in corporate security, a sharp mind for intellectual property law, and a seemingly unblemished record. He was a frequent visitor, his biometric data logged consistently, his movements within the facility always accounted for. Too accounted for, perhaps. There was a subtle anomaly in his employment history, a gap, a period of several years where his roles were vaguely described as special projects or consulting. It was common enough in high-level corporate circles, often denoting classified work or proprietary assignments. But something about the vagueness felt deliberate, a carefully constructed smokescreen. I initiated a deeper query, leveraging my agency's more robust, less public databases. The results began to trickle in, painting a far more complex picture. The special projects weren't just corporate consulting. My gaze sharpened, the pieces starting to click into place with an unnerving precision. Further digging revealed a direct connection to a past scandal involving stolen intellectual property, a highly sophisticated operation that had crippled a rival bioengineering firm years ago. The liaison's name, or rather, his operational alias from that period, surfaced in the periphery of those unconfirmed reports. My breath caught. The implications were staggering. If this individual, the Omnicorp liaison, possessed a background in covert operations and a history of involvement in high-stakes intellectual property theft,
then Thorne's death wasn't just a corporate rivalry gone wrong.
It was a professional hit, meticulously planned and executed by someone with the skill set to bypass Thorne's cutting-edge security, manipulate evidence, and stage a flawless accident. The motive now crystallized. Thorne's final research, the project he'd been so secretive about, must have posed a direct threat to the liaison's past activities or current affiliations. Perhaps Thorne had stumbled upon evidence of the liaison's involvement in the previous scandal, or his new invention jeopardized a black market network built on stolen innovations.
I had found my inside man. Now, I just needed to prove it.
The air in my temporary analysis bay hummed with the low thrum of filtration systems. I watched the projection on the screen, a synthesized report scrolling across the sterile white surface. It detailed a theoretical breakthrough, a complex molecular alignment in Thorne's final project, supposedly indicating a new energy vector, a breakthrough that didn't exist, not yet. This was the bait. I'd spent days crafting it, making it just plausible enough to pique the killer's interest, just ambiguous enough to mask its true purpose. Only someone intimately familiar with Aris Thorne's work, and the specific, proprietary materials he handled, would understand the potential implications of such an accidental discovery. I made sure the report was accessible, but not overtly public. A specific, encrypted channel, one I knew the younger Thorne often monitored under the guise of corporate oversight. I had watched him, discreetly, for weeks, noting his habits, his digital breadcrumbs. He was sharp, driven, and desperate to protect his family's legacy, or perhaps, what he perceived as its future. The narrative I spun was simple, a routine re-evaluation of Thorne's most recent experimental data, leading to an unexpected, promising anomaly. An anomaly that, if real, would validate Aris Thorne's final, most dangerous work. The waiting was the hardest part. Every tick of the clock felt like a hammer striking an anvil. I busied myself with other cases, the mundane details of lesser tragedies, but my attention remained tethered to the digital tripwire I'd set. 2 days passed without a ripple. Then, a subtle tremor. A query log, an IP address attempting to access my secure server, not once, but 3 times, each time with escalating sophistication. It was David Thorne. He was trying to get in, to understand what I had found, to assess the threat. I let him. I even left a digital backdoor ajar, enough for him to download the fabricated report. The moment he did, my own systems registered the intrusion, logging every keystroke, every file accessed. He took the bait. Now, for the trap. I arranged a meeting, ostensibly to discuss the preliminary findings from Aris Thorne's personal effects, a final courtesy to the family. Its stark, clinical environment, the low temperature, the pervasive scent of antiseptic and something deeper, more metallic, served my purpose. It was a place where secrets struggled to breathe. David arrived promptly, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed out of place against the gleaming steel and sterile white tiles. His eyes, though, were sharp, darting, betraying a flicker of apprehension he tried to mask with a practiced calm. "Investigator Reed," he began, his voice smooth, "thank you for seeing me. Any progress on my brother's situation?" I gestured to the examination table, its surface empty, polished to a high sheen. "Please, have a seat. There are some things we need to discuss, David. Specifically, regarding the unique polymer found both in your brother's lab and at a series of unfortunate incidents that preceded his death." His composure wavered, a barely perceptible stiffening of his jaw.
Polymer? I'm not sure I follow.
It's a proprietary composite, I continued, my voice even, developed by your brother for his most sensitive research. A unique molecular signature. We found trace amounts of it at the scene of the lab incident, of course. But we also found it at 2 other locations. A controlled burn in a data storage facility that housed some of Aris's early project notes. And, more recently, at the site of a chemical spill in a secure warehouse, an incident that destroyed vital equipment linked to his prototype development. I watched him, every micro-expression, every shift in his gaze. He swallowed, his eyes now fixed on a spot just beyond my shoulder. Those were accidents.
That was a fabrication, David. A lure. And you took it.
You tried to erase the records of my discovery because you knew what it truly implied.
You knew that if that specific theoretical
breakthrough were real, it would expose the true nature of your brother's work, and the lengths you went to suppress it. His breath hitched. The air in the cold room felt colder, heavier.
I don't know what you're talking about.
The polymer, David, I pressed, stepping closer, my voice dropping to a near whisper.
It wasn't just in the lab.
It was used as an accelerant, a catalyst, designed to mimic accidental failures. The burn patterns, the specific residue from the warehouse spill. They all point to a deliberate act. And the only person who had both the knowledge of that polymer's unique properties and the motive to cover up Aris's trail was you.
You knew Aris was about to expose something far more dangerous than just a new energy source, didn't you? Something Omnicorp didn't want the world to see. The dam broke.
His shoulders slumped, the carefully constructed facade crumbling. He looked at the empty examination table, a mirror perhaps to the emptiness he now felt. He was going to ruin everything, David confessed, his voice rough, barely audible above the low hum of the refrigeration units. Not just for him, but for all of us.
Omnicorp. They approached me months ago.
Aris was developing a bioweapon, not an energy source. A targeted viral agent. He had ethical qualms, of course.
Threatened to expose the entire project, expose their funding, their research. They tasked me. Said it was the only way to contain the damage. To neutralize him, and make it look like an accident. A catastrophic lab failure. They promised to protect me, protect our name. I used the polymer. I fought. The air in the trauma center cold room awaiting examination felt colder than before, the chill now laced with the acrid scent of a broken confession. David Thorne's words, "I just wanted to make it stop," echoed in the sterile space, a desperate plea that ripped through the carefully constructed facade of an accident. My gaze lingered on his face, the raw agony there, before I shifted my attention to the uniformed officer already moving in. "Secure him," I commanded, my voice flat, devoid of the complex emotions swirling within me. The officer, a burly man with a no-nonsense demeanor, nodded, his hand already on David's shoulder. David offered no resistance, his eyes vacant, fixed on some unseen point beyond the stainless steel gurney where his brother's still form lay. The weight of his betrayal, the calculated precision of his actions to silence his brother's research, settled heavy in the room. This wasn't just a family tragedy, it was a corporate assassination, disguised with meticulous care. I looked at Dr. Thorne's covered body,
the victim of a conspiracy far larger than a simple lab accident. My initial hunch about the microscopic trace, the unusual burn pattern, had led me down a rabbit hole of corporate greed and scientific ambition. The truth, now laid bare, was uglier than I'd anticipated. My next calls were swift and precise. The lead investigator from the federal agency, a stern-faced woman named Agent Davies, answered on the second ring. I relayed David's confession, detailing the method, the motive, and the wider implication he'd alluded to regarding Omnicorp's executives. Her response was clipped, professional, but I could hear the shift in her tone, the quiet recognition that the dam had finally broken. The following hours blurred into a whirlwind of activity. Briefings, debriefings, endless questions. David Thorne, once a grieving brother, was now a key witness, his testimony, however reluctant, unlocking a Pandora's box of corporate malfeasance. He detailed how specific Omnicorp board members had pressured him, how they'd seen Dr. Thorne's independent research as a threat, a rogue variable that could expose their own unethical projects and financial manipulations. He described the pressure, the threats against his own family, the agonizing choice between his brother's life and their perceived safety. The unraveling was spectacular. Based on David's detailed confession and the digital evidence I'd previously secured from Dr. Thorne's encrypted drives, search warrants were executed across Omnicorp's various facilities and the private residences of several high-ranking executives. I watched, exhausted, as news channels erupted. The initial reports were fragmented, speculative, but the sheer scale of the law enforcement presence at Omnicorp headquarters left no room for doubt. By dawn, the first high-profile arrests were made. The CEO, the head of research and development, and two key board members of Omnicorp were taken into custody. Their faces, usually composed and arrogant in media appearances, now looked pale and bewildered as they were led away in handcuffs. The media firestorm was immediate and unprecedented. Every major news outlet ran with the story Omnicorp scandal, bioengineer murder conspiracy, corporate greed exposed. My name, Reed, was mentioned in passing, a footnote to the unfolding drama, which suited me just fine. I preferred the quiet precision of evidence over the glare of the spotlight. Yet, even amidst the chaos, a profound unease settled within me. The public shock was palpable, a collective gasp at the depths of corporate depravity. But beneath the outrage, a different debate began to brew. Dr. Thorne's research, once a secret, was now headline news. His groundbreaking work, designed to revolutionize cellular regeneration, was suddenly the subject of intense scrutiny. Was it a miracle cure, or a terrifying step towards unforeseen consequences? The ethical implications, the very definition of scientific advancement, were laid bare for the world to dissect. I sat in a quiet corner of the command center, the relentless chatter of news anchors filtering through a nearby monitor. The faces of politicians and international delegates flashed across the screen, all expressing their profound concern, their intent to secure Dr. Thorne's research. Governments and international organizations, once oblivious, now vied for control, recognizing the immense power and potential danger inherent in his discoveries. The same research that led to Dr. Thorne's murder was now a global commodity, a prize to be won. The tension in the air was thick, not just from the ongoing arrests, but from the weight of what we had unleashed. I had solved the murder, yes, but in doing so, I had cracked open a much larger question: at what cost does humanity pursue progress? And who ultimately holds the reins of such power? The answers were far from clear, and the future of Dr. Thorne's legacy, a beacon of hope twisted into an instrument of death, hung precariously in the balance. David Thorne's words, "I just wanted to make it stop," echoed in the sterile space, a desperate plea that ripped through the carefully constructed facade of an accident, an ambition, a future. I stood there, long after the uniformed officers had led him away, after the recording devices were packed, after the silence had returned, thick and suffocating. My gaze drifted across the stainless steel surfaces, reflecting the harsh overhead lights. This room, designed for dispassionate analysis, now held the lingering ghost of a man's despair. He hadn't meant to kill Aris, he'd insisted, his voice cracking, but the panic, the accidental ignition of volatile compounds, the sealed lab doors, it had all spiraled. A desperate act to stop a dangerous dream, one that claimed 2 lives in its wake. The truth, when it finally emerged, was rarely simple. It was a tangled knot of ambition, fear, and a love so twisted it became destructive. Aris Thorne, the brilliant bioengineer, had been so consumed by his vision, so certain of its benevolent potential, that he'd become blind to the precipice he teetered upon. And David, his brother, had seen the chasm, felt the ground crumbling, and made a desperate, catastrophic choice. The sophisticated and deliberate act of murder I'd initially envisioned had been, in essence, a desperate, clumsy attempt to dismantle a creation before it could consume them all. The killer was intimately familiar with Thorne's work, yes, but not to exploit it, but to destroy it. The ethical implications of Aris Thorne's research now weighed heavier than the specific details of his demise. He hadn't been building a weapon, not intentionally. He believed he was forging a new path for humanity, a way to transcend biological limitations. But at what cost? David Thorne had seen the hubris, the potential for irreversible damage, and had acted as he believed necessary. His confession, delivered in a voice choked with grief and regret, wasn't a triumph for me, but a somber confirmation of humanity's capacity for both breathtaking innovation and profound self-destruction. My role in that was done. I had presented the facts, the evidence, the narrative woven from the smallest fragments. The rest belonged to others. My boots clicked on the linoleum, each step resonating with a weariness that settled deep in my bones. This case, like so many others, had exacted a toll. It wasn't just the late nights or the intricate puzzles. But even as the fatigue pressed down, a different sensation began to stir, a quiet resolve. The world wouldn't stop inventing, wouldn't stop pushing boundaries, wouldn't stop creating both wonders and potential horrors. My work, then, was a necessary counterpoint. To stand watch, to decipher the truth when the consequences of that progress inevitably led to ruin. To be the one who looked for the microscopic trace, the unusual burn pattern, not just to solve a crime, but to understand the forces that drove it. I walked towards the exit, the harsh fluorescent lights giving way to the muted glow of the late afternoon outside. The air carried the scent of rain and distant traffic, a world moving on, oblivious to the quiet drama that had just concluded inside. Thorne's case was closed, the truth laid bare. But the struggle between progress and peril, the delicate balance between pushing the limits of knowledge and respecting the boundaries of ethics, that would continue. It always did. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out, seeing the caller ID for a colleague from the regional bureau. A new case, no doubt. Something complex, something demanding, something that would require me to once again sift through the debris of human error and intent. I answered the call. Read here. The world was waiting.